How do you know my father? The question cut through the cold autumn air before either of them realized how much it would change their lives. The traffic light had only just turned green when the black Bentley rolled forward and lightly bumped the rear of an aging Ford pickup truck. It wasn't a serious accident. No shattered glass. No twisted metal. Just the dull sound of two very different worlds touching for the first time. Ethan Brooks stepped out of his truck and glanced at the small dent above the bumper. His faded denim jacket carried traces of motor oil from a long day at the repair shop, and the cool Nebraska wind tugged gently at his sleeves. Across from him, the driver's door of the Bentley swung open. Ava Sinclair emerged with the kind of presence people noticed immediately. Her tailored coat probably cost more than Ethan's truck was worth. Her blonde hair moved softly in the breeze as she looked at the damage with visible frustration. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Just great." Ethan looked at her for a moment and then asked a question she wasn't expecting. "Are you okay?" Ava blinked. "Excuse me. Were you hurt?" Ethan repeated calmly. "That's what matters." For a brief second, she seemed almost confused. Most people recognized her. Most people saw the Bentley, saw the Sinclair name, saw opportunity. But this man seemed more concerned about her well-being than the accident itself. "I'm fine," she answered. "And your truck?" Ethan shrugged. "It's older than both of us put together. A scratch won't hurt its feelings." Something about his response irritated her even more. Maybe because it sounded sincere. Maybe because she wasn't used to sincerity. The afternoon sun hung low above the town square, casting long shadows across the street. Cars moved around them, while pedestrians slowed to watch. Ava reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "Let's exchange insurance information." Ethan nodded. "Sure." As he reached for his wallet, a small leather keychain hanging from the rearview mirror swayed gently in the breeze. Ava's eyes landed on it. Her breath caught instantly. The world around her seemed to fade. The traffic noise disappeared. The voices disappeared. Even the wind seemed to stop moving. The keychain was old and worn. Attached to it was a military identification tag, not unusual by itself. But engraved on the metal was a name she knew better than her own. Richard Sinclair. Her father. Ava stared at it without blinking. Her heart suddenly hammered against her chest. That couldn't be possible. Her father had been gone for 7 years. The tag had disappeared long before his funeral. Nobody knew where it went. Nobody had ever found it. Slowly, she lifted her eyes toward Ethan. "Where did you get that?" Ethan followed her gaze and looked toward the tag. For the first time, his calm expression shifted. Only slightly, but enough. "This?" he asked quietly. Ava stepped closer. "That belonged to my father." Ethan said nothing. The silence between them stretched. The distant sound of a train horn echoed across town. Somewhere nearby, church bells began ringing the hour. Ava felt her pulse quicken. "Who are you?" she demanded. "How do you know Richard Sinclair?" Ethan looked away briefly toward the fading horizon. His eyes carried something unexpected. Not fear. Not guilt. Something heavier. Something older. The kind of sadness people learn to carry quietly. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm enough to almost disappear into the wind. "Your father was a good man." Ava froze. Those words hit harder than the accident itself. Almost nobody talked about Richard Sinclair that way anymore. To the world, he was a billionaire. A business icon. A legend. But this stranger had said it differently. Like he remembered the man instead of the empire. Like he had known him personally. Ethan glanced toward his truck, then back at Ava. The setting sun reflected softly across the worn metal of the old pickup. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. And neither of them understood that the small collision on an ordinary street had just reopened a secret buried for more than 20 years. A secret powerful enough to change everything Ava believed about her father, and powerful enough to reveal why Ethan Brooks had spent 7 years protecting a promise he was never supposed to break. Ava Sinclair did not move for several seconds after Ethan spoke. The evening traffic continued flowing around them, headlights beginning to appear as daylight slowly surrendered to dusk, but her attention remained fixed on the man standing beside the old pickup truck. She had spent years listening to interviews, speeches, documentaries, and boardroom stories about Richard Sinclair. People called him brilliant, ruthless, visionary, powerful. Yet somehow this stranger had chosen a different word. Good. The word lingered in her mind like an unfinished melody. "You knew him personally," she said quietly. It was not a question anymore. Ethan glanced at the military tag hanging from the mirror. A long time ago. Ava folded her arms. That does not explain why you have something that belonged to my father. Ethan looked toward the courthouse clock tower across the street. The golden light reflected softly against the brick buildings lining Main Street. Some things are not easy to explain in the middle of an intersection. Ava studied him carefully. He did not seem nervous. He did not seem excited. Most people became uncomfortable around her. Some became overly polite. Others became eager. Ethan appeared to be neither. It was as though the Sinclair name carried no special weight with him at all. Then explain it somewhere else, she replied. Because I am not leaving without answers. Ethan sighed quietly. Before he could respond, a voice called from the sidewalk. Dad. Both turned. A young girl around 11 years old stood near the entrance of a small bookstore, holding a paper bag. Her blonde hair moved gently in the evening breeze. Lily, Ethan said with a faint smile. I thought you were waiting inside. Mrs. Harper gave me a cinnamon roll, Lily said proudly, lifting the bag. Then she noticed Ava. Oh, sorry. Ava watched the interaction carefully. Something softened in Ethan's face when he looked at his daughter. The guarded expression disappeared. The weight in his eyes seemed lighter. For the first time, Ava saw not a mystery, but a father. Everything okay? Lily asked. Ethan nodded. Just a little accident. Lily examined the Bentley, and then the old pickup. Looks expensive. Ethan laughed softly. That is one way to describe it. Ava surprised herself by smiling. Only briefly. But it happened. Lily noticed. Children always notice things adults missed. Hi, Lily said. I am Lily Brooks. Ava Sinclair. The girl blinked. Like Sinclair Industries? Ava nodded. That's Sinclair. Lily's eyes widened slightly before she looked back at Ethan. Dad, that is the company Grandpa Richard used to talk about. The smile vanished from Ava's face instantly. Grandpa Richard? She repeated. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Not in anger. Not in frustration. More like a man watching a door open that he had spent years keeping closed. Lily looked confused. Was I not supposed to say that? Ethan knelt beside her. It is okay, sweetheart. Ava felt her pulse quicken again. Why would your daughter call him Grandpa Richard? The question hung between them. Ethan stood slowly. The air had become colder. Somewhere nearby, the smell of fresh coffee drifted from a corner cafe. People laughed inside. A delivery truck rolled past. Ordinary sounds from an ordinary evening. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Because he knew her, Ethan finally said. Ava stared at him. My father knew your daughter? Since the day she was born. Ava could barely process the words. That was impossible. She would have known. She would have remembered. Richard Sinclair's schedule had been documented down to the hour by assistants and executives. There was no room for secret friendships. No room for hidden lives. Yet standing here, looking at Ethan and Lily, certainty began slipping through her fingers. The foundation of everything she thought she knew about her father was beginning to crack. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and handed Ava a small business card. It was worn around the edges from years of use. Brooks Auto Repair. His name. His number. His address. Nothing impressive. Nothing mysterious. At least on the surface. I close the shop at 6 tomorrow, Ethan said. If you still want answers, come by. Ava accepted the card. And if I do? Ethan looked at the fading sunlight stretching across the town square. Then you might learn that your father was not the man the newspapers wrote about. He glanced once toward the military tag hanging inside the truck. And you might learn why he trusted me with something he never trusted anyone else to keep. Edit the next morning Ava Sinclair arrived at Sinclair Tower before sunrise, something she had not done in years. The city skyline was still wrapped in pale blue light as she stepped into her private office on the 42nd floor. Usually the room felt powerful. Today it felt uncertain. Ethan Brooks had given her more questions than answers, and questions were something Ava hated. She sat behind the massive walnut desk that had once belonged to her father and stared at the business card lying beside her coffee cup. Brooks Auto Repair. The card looked ordinary. Too ordinary. She pressed a button on her desk phone. Megan, I need a full background report. On whom? Her assistant asked. Ava glanced at the card. Ethan Brooks. Every address. Every employer. Every public record. Everything. Understood. 2 hours later the report arrived. Ava expected complexity. She expected hidden companies, offshore accounts, secret investments, or connections to powerful people. Instead she found almost nothing. Ethan Brooks, age 42, owner of a small repair shop, widower, one daughter, no lawsuits, no criminal record, no luxury properties, no unexplained wealth, no headlines, no scandals, just a quiet life stretching across page after page. Ava leaned back in her chair. That cannot be right. She opened another file, then another. Still nothing. The man who apparently knew her father better than anyone outside the family seemed almost invisible. By noon, her frustration had grown. Richard Sinclair had spent decades surrounded by executives, politicians, advisors, and investors. Yet somehow the man holding one of his most personal possessions was a mechanic from a small Nebraska town. It made no sense. Her office windows overlooked thousands of people moving through the city below. Taxis, buses, construction crews, business professionals, everyone rushing somewhere. Yet Ava could not stop thinking about Ethan's calm voice. Your father was a good man. The words continued echoing in her mind. Around 3 o'clock, another document appeared in her inbox. It was an old photograph recovered from archived records connected to one of Richard Sinclair's charitable foundations. Ava opened it. Her breath caught instantly. The photograph showed her father standing beside a much younger Ethan Brooks. Both men were smiling. Neither appeared to notice the camera. They stood near a lake under a bright summer sky. There were fishing poles leaning against a dock. A cooler sat nearby. They looked less like a billionaire and a me. The bell above the shop door chimed softly as Ava stepped inside. The scent of motor oil, fresh coffee, and aged wood filled the air. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted long golden stripes across the concrete floor. Ethan was already waiting. He stood beside the doorway of the small office at the back of the garage, one hand resting lightly against the frame. Lily looked up from her homework and offered a polite smile before gathering her notebooks. I will be in the break room, Dad, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. Ava watched as the girl disappeared down the hallway. There was trust in that simple exchange. The kind of trust built over years. The kind that could not be bought. Ethan opened the office door. Come in. Ava entered slowly. The room was modest. A wooden desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets, a coffee maker humming softly in the corner. Yet her attention went immediately to the framed photograph hanging on the wall. Richard Sinclair stood beside Ethan near a lakeside dock. Both men looked younger, happier, real. Ava stared at it. I have never seen this picture before. Ethan followed her gaze. Most people never did. Why? Ethan was silent for a moment. Then he walked toward the wooden box resting on a shelf beneath the photograph. He lifted it carefully, almost reverently, and placed it on the desk between them. The box was worn smooth with age. Its brass hinges carried faint scratches. The wood itself seemed polished not by tools, but by years of human hands. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken. Is that what he left you? She asked. Ethan sat down slowly. Part of it. Outside, the distant rumble of traffic drifted through the garage doors. Somewhere a radio played an old country song. Ordinary sounds continued moving through an ordinary afternoon, while something extraordinary sat quietly between them. Ava lowered herself into the chair across from him. I want the truth. Ethan studied her face. Are you sure? Why would you ask that? Because sometimes the truth changes more than the lie ever did. The words settled heavily in the room. Ava folded her hands together. I spent 7 years believing there were no secrets left. Ethan nodded. That is exactly what your father feared. Slowly he opened the wooden box. Inside rested several items wrapped with careful precision. Old photographs, handwritten letters, a leather journal, a faded baseball cap, and beneath them all, a small cassette recorder. Ava stared at the recorder. What is that? Ethan looked down at it. His expression softened. A promise. The office seemed smaller suddenly. Quieter. Even the hum of the coffee machine felt distant. Ava reached toward the journal, but stopped herself. Why did my father give these to you? Ethan leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, he appeared lost in memory. 20 years ago, your father came through this town during one of the hardest periods of his life. Ava frowned. My father never came to this town. According to the public record, no. Ethan smiled faintly. But your father spent weeks here every year. Ava blinked. Weeks. Sometimes longer. Her mind raced. Board meetings, corporate events, charity galas. She remembered entire stretches of time when Richard Sinclair had supposedly been traveling overseas or attending private negotiations. Could those trips have been something else entirely? Ethan lifted one photograph from the box and handed it to her. Ava looked down. The image showed her father wearing jeans and a fishing jacket, sitting beside a campfire with Ethan. There were no bodyguards, no executives, no cameras, just two friends sharing coffee beneath a starlit sky. She could barely recognize him. Why would he hide this? She whispered. Ethan looked toward the photograph on the wall. Because out here nobody cared how much money he had. Ava swallowed hard. A strange ache formed in her chest. She had spent her life sharing her father with corporations, shareholders, reporters, and strangers. Yet somehow this small town had known a version of him she never met. Ethan gently closed the box. Not fully, just enough to protect its contents. There is a reason he trusted me with all of this. Ava lifted her eyes. What reason? Ethan's expression grew serious. Outside the office window, the sunlight began fading behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the garage floor. The day itself seemed to be holding its breath. Ethan rested one hand on the closed lid of the wooden box. Because shortly before he died, he said quietly, Richard Sinclair discovered something that frightened him more than losing his fortune. Ava felt her pulse stop for a second. What was it? Ethan looked directly into her eyes. He was afraid his daughter would never know who he really was. Ed at the office fell silent after Ethan's words. Ava stared at him, searching for some sign that he was exaggerating, some hint that this was merely nostalgia wrapped in mystery. Instead, she found only quiet certainty. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the room, turning the old wooden box into something that seemed to belong to another time. Ethan reached for the coffee pot and poured 2 cups. The rich aroma filled the air between them. Your father spent most of his life being needed by everyone, he said softly. Employees, investors, reporters, board members, politicians. Every room he entered wanted something from him. Ava lowered her eyes. That comes with success. Ethan nodded. Maybe, but sometimes success can be the loneliest thing a person owns. He slid a photograph across the desk. Ava picked it up carefully. It showed Richard Sinclair sitting on the tailgate of an old truck beside a lake. He was holding a fishing rod and laughing. Truly laughing. Not the polished smile she remembered from magazine covers. This was different. Human. Unguarded. When was this taken? She asked. 17 years ago. Ava continued staring at the image. I do not remember him taking vacations here. Ethan smiled faintly. Because they were never called vacations. Outside, a breeze rattled the leaves of a maple tree near the garage entrance. The sound drifted softly through the open window. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Every year your father would disappear for a few weeks. Ava nodded. Business trips. That is what everyone believed. Ethan folded his hands. The truth is he came here. Ava looked up sharply. Ethan continued. He rented a small cabin outside town. No assistants. No security team. No meetings. He drove an old pickup truck and introduced himself as Rick. Ava blinked. Rick? Most people never knew his last name. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The cassette recorder sat inside the wooden box like an object suspended between the past and the present. Ava could hear the faint ticking of a wall clock somewhere in the garage. Each second seemed louder than the last. Ethan looked down at the recorder and carefully lifted it into his hands. The plastic surface had faded with age. A small piece of masking tape was attached to the side. Richard's handwriting was still visible. Ava immediately recognized it. Her father had always written with neat, deliberate strokes. Seeing those familiar letters again sent an unexpected ache through her chest. The last time I saw him was right here, Ethan said quietly. He arrived just before sunset. Ava listened without moving. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the office window as though he could still see that evening unfolding. He looked tired. Ava frowned. My father always looked tired. Ethan shook his head gently. No, this was different. Outside, the sky had begun turning shades of amber and blue. The first evening stars were appearing above the town. The atmosphere felt strangely similar to the memory Ethan was describing. He stayed after closing. Ethan continued. We sat outside with coffee and watched the sun go down. Ava lowered her gaze. She tried to imagine her father sitting quietly on a small-town repair shop porch instead of standing behind a podium or inside a boardroom. The image felt both foreign and comforting. At first he talked about ordinary things, Ethan said. Fishing, the weather, Lily's school. A faint smile touched his face. He always remembered every detail about her. Ava swallowed hard. He remembered details about everyone. Ethan nodded. That was one of the reasons people trusted him. The office grew quiet again. Then Ethan's expression became more serious. But eventually the conversation changed. Ava looked up. How? Ethan carefully placed the recorder on the desk. He told me he had spent years building an empire. His voice softened. Then he asked me a question. Ava leaned forward slightly. What question? Ethan smiled sadly. He asked whether any of it would matter if the people he loved never truly knew him. The words settled over the room like falling snow. Ava stared at the recorder. She could almost hear her father's voice asking it. Not as a billionaire. Not as a public figure. Simply as a man. Ethan folded his hands. That night he talked about regrets. Ava's eyes widened. My father never discussed regret. Not publicly. Ethan looked at her kindly. But private conversations are different. A cool breeze drifted through the partially open window carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Somewhere outside, Lily laughed at something she had read in a book. The simple sound seemed to make the room feel even more personal. More real. He told me he worried that success had become a wall. Ethan said. Not a bridge. Ava remained silent. He worried that people saw the company instead of the man. Ethan paused. Most of all, he worried about you. The words struck her immediately. Me? Yes. Ethan nodded. He said you were strong, intelligent, determined. A faint smile appeared. He was very proud of you. Ava looked away before Ethan could see the emotion gathering in her eyes. For years she had wanted to hear those words directly. Now they were arriving through someone else. Through a mechanic in a small Nebraska town. Ethan gently tapped the recorder with one finger. Before he left that night, he handed me this. Ava's attention returned instantly. Why? Ethan took a slow breath. Because he believed there might come a day when you needed to hear something in his own voice. The office seemed to stop moving. Even the ticking clock faded into the background. Ava stared at the recorder as though it contained an entire missing chapter of her life. You mean there is a message on it? She whispered. Ethan met her eyes. Yes. Her heartbeat quickened. Then why have you waited 7 years? Ethan's expression grew solemn. The fading sunlight cast shadows across the desk between them. Because your father gave me one condition. Ava felt every muscle tighten. What condition? Ethan looked down at the recorder one final time before answering. He told me that the message could only be played when you were finally ready to hear the truth about who he really was. The words lingered in the air long after Ethan spoke them. Ava sat motionless, staring at the cassette recorder as if it might suddenly come alive on its own. Outside, evening settled gently across the town. The last rays of sunlight slipped behind the rooftops, and the glow from the garage lights reflected softly against the office window. For years she had believed she understood her father. Not completely, perhaps, but enough. Now every certainty seemed to be unraveling. How would he know when I was ready? She asked quietly. Ethan looked at her with calm eyes. He said you would stop searching for the billionaire and start searching for the man. Ava lowered her gaze. The answer struck deeper than she wanted to admit. For 7 years, she had protected Richard Sinclair's legacy. She had expanded the company, increased its value, preserved its reputation. Yet she had spent very little time asking who her father had been when nobody was watching. Ethan opened a drawer and removed a small envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Her father's handwriting covered the front. Ava's breath caught immediately. That is for you, Ethan said. She hesitated before taking it. The paper felt fragile beneath her fingertips. You never opened it? Ethan shook his head. It was not mine to read. Ava carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Dear Ethan, if you were giving this to Ava, then I trust your judgment. That single sentence was enough to make her chest tighten. She continued reading silently. The letter was short. No business instructions. No financial details. No mention of company assets or family trusts. Instead, it spoke about trust, friendship, and time. Most of all, it spoke about regret. When Ava reached the final line, her eyes lingered there. Some truths must arrive when the heart is ready, not when the calendar says it is time. She looked up slowly. He really thought about all of this. Ethan smiled sadly. More than you know. The office grew quiet again. Then Ethan reached into the wooden box and removed a second item. This time it was a folded map. Creases ran across the paper from years of careful storage. Ava frowned. What is that? Ethan unfolded it across the desk. It showed a lake several miles outside town. A narrow dirt road wound through a patch of woodland before ending at a small cabin marked with a red circle. Ava stared at it. The cabin. Ethan nodded. Your father's favorite place in the world. She blinked. Not his penthouse. No, not his ranch in Colorado. Ethan smiled. Definitely not. For the first time all evening, a faint laugh escaped Ava. It vanished almost immediately, but the tension in the room softened. Ethan pointed toward the red circle on the map. Every summer he came here. Sometimes alone. Sometimes with me. Ava studied the location. The cabin sat beside a quiet stretch of water far from highways and cities. It looked insignificant, yet somehow that made it feel important. What happened there? She asked. Ethan looked toward the recorder. That is where he made the recording. Ava followed his gaze. Her pulse quickened again. You have listened to it? Only once. What did he say? Ethan was silent. Outside, the sound of crickets drifted through the evening air. A distant train horn echoed across the countryside. Ordinary sounds. Peaceful sounds. Yet beneath them rested something much larger. Ethan finally spoke. He told the truth. Ava leaned forward. About what? Ethan's expression grew solemn. About why he disappeared every year. The room seemed to narrow around her. You mean the cabin? Ethan nodded. The company believed he came here to escape stress. Ava waited. Ethan rested one hand on the recorder. But the real reason had nothing to do with business. He paused. And everything to do with a promise he made long before you were born. The office felt unusually still after Ethan's last words. Ava stared at the maps spread across the desk while questions raced through her mind. A promise made before she was born. A hidden cabin. Secret summers. A recorder filled with truths her father had never spoken aloud. None of it fit the man the world believed it knew. Ethan carefully folded the map and placed it back inside the wooden box. The movement was slow and deliberate, as though every item carried weight far beyond paper and wood. The promise began almost 30 years ago, he said quietly. Ava lifted her eyes. Before the company became what it is today? Ethan nodded. Long before the headlines. Long before private jets and boardrooms. Outside, the evening sky deepened into shades of navy blue. The glow from a nearby street lamp cast soft reflections across the office window. Somewhere in the garage, a tool settled with a faint metallic sound. Ethan rested his hands on the desk. Your father grew up believing success would solve every problem. Ava gave a faint smile. That sounds like him. Yes, Ethan agreed. But life has a way of teaching different lessons. He opened the wooden box once more and removed an old photograph. The edges were faded. Time had softened the colors. Ava accepted it carefully. Her father looked much younger. He stood beside a modest lakeside cabin with another man she did not recognize. Both were smiling. Both appeared completely ordinary. Who is that? She asked. Ethan looked at the photograph. His best friend. Ava frowned. I have never heard his name. Almost nobody has. Ethan's voice softened. That was intentional. Ava studied the image more closely. The unknown man looked kind. Honest. The sort of person who would never appear on a magazine cover. What happened to him? She asked. Ethan was silent for a moment. He became the reason your father kept returning here. The answer only deepened the mystery. Ava leaned forward. I do not understand. Ethan looked toward the recorder. Years ago, your father and his friend made a promise to each other. A simple promise. He paused. No matter how successful life became, they would never forget who they were. Ava lowered her gaze. The words sounded simple, yet somehow they carried enormous weight. Ethan continued. For a while they kept that promise. Every year they met at the cabin. No titles. No status. No business discussions. A faint smile appeared. Just fishing, coffee, and friendship. The office seemed warmer as Ethan spoke. Ava could almost picture it. Early mornings on a quiet lake. Two men escaping the noise of the world. Two friends holding on to something real. Then Ethan's expression changed. The smile faded. But life changed. Ava immediately sensed the shift. What happened? Ethan exhaled slowly. One day your father's friend became seriously ill. The room fell quiet. Ava looked back at the photograph. Suddenly it felt different. More fragile. More important. Ethan folded his hands. Your father visited him every chance he could, even when nobody knew where he was going. Ava listened carefully. The company thought he was traveling for business. Most of the time. Ethan nodded, but he was actually keeping a promise. A lump formed in Ava's throat. Her father had spent years being praised for leadership and ambition. Yet some of his most meaningful choices had happened completely out of public view. Ethan glanced at the recorder again. When his friend realized he would not have much time left, he asked your father for one thing. Ava's heartbeat quickened. What? Ethan's voice became barely above a whisper. He asked him to take care of someone after he was gone. Ava stared at him. The office suddenly felt smaller. The silence deeper. Ethan looked directly into her eyes. And that promise eventually led your father to me, to Lily, and to a secret he never intended to carry alone. Ava felt as though the room had tilted slightly beneath her feet. She looked from Ethan to the photograph and back again, trying to fit the pieces together. The answer seemed close enough to touch, yet still hidden behind years of silence. Outside, night had fully settled over the town. The garage lights cast a warm glow across the parking lot, and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees created a quiet rhythm beneath the conversation. You? Ava asked softly. You were the person he promised to help? Ethan nodded. After my wife passed away, I was raising Lily alone. Money was tight. The repair shop was struggling. Some months I honestly did not know how I would keep everything together. Ava listened without interrupting. Ethan's voice remained calm, but she could hear the weight of old memories beneath every word. Your father's friend knew about my situation. He glanced at the photograph. Before he passed, he asked Richard to keep an eye on us. Ava lowered her gaze. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. The secret visits, the hidden friendship, the summers at the cabin, the concern for Lily. None of it had been random. None of it had been business. It had been loyalty. Ethan opened the wooden box one final time and carefully lifted the cassette recorder into both hands. The object no longer seemed mysterious. It seemed sacred. For years, he said quietly, Richard checked in on us. Sometimes directly, sometimes without us knowing. Ava felt emotion tightening in her chest. And he never told anyone? Ethan smiled faintly. That was not the kind of man he wanted credit for. The office fell silent again. Ava thought about every article ever written about her father. Every award. Every speech. Every interview. None of them had mentioned this. None of them had mentioned friendship, or promises, or quiet acts of kindness performed when nobody was watching. Ethan carefully placed the recorder on the desk between them. There is something else you should know. Ava looked up immediately. What? Ethan's eyes softened. The last time he came here, he already knew his health was failing. Ava froze. He had never spoken openly about that period. The family had been told only what was necessary. The realization struck her harder than she expected. Ethan continued. He spent most of that visit talking about you. Her eyes filled instantly. Me? He worried he had spent too much time building a future and not enough time living inside it. Ethan looked toward the recorder. He said if there was one thing he wished he could change, it was making sure you understood how deeply he loved you. Ava lowered her head. For a moment she could not speak. The office seemed impossibly quiet. Even the wind outside had faded. Ethan reached into the box and removed a small key. It was old brass, polished smooth by years of use. He placed it beside the recorder. What is that? Ava whispered. The cabin key. She stared at it. He wanted you to have it. The words settled over her like a blanket. Warm. Heavy. Final. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward the office window. The company.